Late morning, Germany, 1943. Inside a guarded command center, maps cover the walls from floor to ceiling. Red and blue pins mark cities, factories, airfields. Phones ring, then fall silent. Officers wait, listening to reports that no longer sound like routine updates. High above the Reich, the sky has begun to change. Not a single raid, not scattered bombers, but formations, thick, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. American B-17s appear in numbers German air defenses were never designed to face. Long silver streams, crossing borders in daylight, holding formation under fire, returning again and again. What had once been dismissed as an experiment now reveals itself as a system. Industrial, relentless, and expanding. For years, Adolf Hitler had believed Germany could absorb bombing, that its cities could endure, that the Luftwaffe would break any enemy in the air before damage became decisive. But the reports coming in now say something different. They describe skies filled with aircraft, fighter units burning fuel faster than it can be replaced, factories shaking under repeated blows. And in that moment, a realization begins to take shape, quiet, unwelcome, and irreversible. One that leads directly to how the war arrived at this point. When the war began in 1939, Germany believed it understood air power. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated its value early: Warsaw, Rotterdam, France. Air attacks were sharp, tactical, and closely tied to ground operations. Bombing in German doctrine was meant to open the way for armies, not to fight wars on its own. Cities were targets of opportunity, not primary objectives. This belief shaped everything that followed. By 1940 and 1941, Britain had already tried to break Germany from the air. The Royal Air Force bombed at night, striking industrial centers deep inside the Reich. But navigation was poor. Accuracy was limited. Losses were high. German leadership studied the results and drew a comfortable conclusion. Bombing was disruptive, but not decisive. Hitler absorbed this lesson fully. He believed Germany's industrial depth, dispersal, and discipline would allow it to endure any air campaign. Civilian morale, he argued, had survived worse in the First World War. The Reich's air defenses, radar belts, flak towers, night fighters, were expanding every month. There was no reason to believe an enemy could do more than harass. Then, America entered the war. After December 1941, German planners still saw the United States as an industrial giant, slow to mobilize and clumsy in execution. Distance, they assumed, would dilute American power. Training air crews took time. Building bombers took time. Shipping them across the Atlantic took even longer. In Berlin, this delay was mistaken for weakness. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that the United States did not intend to imitate Britain's approach. American air doctrine was built on a different premise: daylight bombing, flown-in tight formations aimed at specific industrial targets, defended not by darkness, but by mass. The decision was formalized in January 1943 at the Casablanca Conference. There, Allied leaders approved the combined bomber offensive. Britain would bomb by night. The Americans would bomb by day. Together, they would apply continuous pressure, 24 hours a day, against Germany's war economy. For Hitler, this distinction mattered little, at first. Daylight bombing seemed reckless. Flying heavy bombers in clear skies, without escort fighters deep into Germany, appeared suicidal. Losses, German analysts predicted, would force the Americans to abandon the idea quickly. The Luftwaffe, still confident after years of dominance, expected decisive interceptions. But even as these assumptions hardened, changes were already underway. Across Britain, airfields filled with unfamiliar aircraft, 4-engine bombers larger than anything Germany fielded in numbers. Crews trained not for individual survival, but for formation discipline. Industrial targets were photographed, measured, and cataloged in detail. By late 1942, small American formations began probing German airspace. They were not yet overwhelming, but they were persistent. And with each mission, the gap between German expectations and American intent quietly narrowed, setting the stage for a confrontation Germany had not prepared to fight. By the start of 1943, the American air presence in Britain was no longer theoretical. It was visible, measurable, and accelerating. Airfields across East Anglia expanded almost overnight. Runways lengthened, hangars multiplied, villages filled with foreign uniforms and unfamiliar accents. The 8th Air Force, once a planning concept, now existed as an operational machine, fed by American industry and protected by Britain's geography. At the center of this force stood the B-17 Flying Fortress. Designed for altitude, endurance, and defense, the aircraft reflected American thinking about air war. Each bomber carried multiple heavy machine guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire when flown in formation. Survival was not individual, it was collective. Crews were trained to hold position under attack, even as aircraft around them burned or fell away. German analysts underestimated this discipline. Early interceptions inflicted losses, but not the collapse Berlin expected. Bombers absorbed punishment and continued to targets. Others turned back damaged, yet returned days later. Replacement aircraft arrived faster than German fighters could be built. What appeared costly was, in fact, sustainable. The targets themselves signaled American intent. Rather than area bombing, U.S. planners selected specific nodes of Germany's war economy. Aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, fuel production, transportation hubs. Each mission was logged, evaluated, and refined. When accuracy fell short, formations adjusted. When defenses stiffened, routes shifted. To German defenders, this method felt alien. The Luftwaffe had been built for short-range dominance, not prolonged attrition. Fighter units scrambled repeatedly in a single day, burning fuel reserves and wearing down pilots faster than replacements could be trained. Maintenance crews worked through the night, preparing aircraft already pushed beyond design limits. And still, the bombers came. Hitler's confidence in air defense began to erode not through catastrophe, but through accumulation. Loss reports grew steadily. Ammunition consumption outpaced forecasts. Radar stations tracked formations too large to engage cleanly. Flak units fired until barrels glowed, often with little effect at altitude. Yet, at the highest levels, belief persisted. American losses were highlighted. Mission failures were exaggerated. Goering assured the Führer that the Luftwaffe would adapt, that new tactics, heavier weapons, and aggressive interception would restore control of the skies. But beneath these assurances, German intelligence faced an uncomfortable reality. American production curves did not flatten. They climbed. Each month, more bombers appeared. Crews rotated in fresh, formations thickened. What had begun as raids now resembled scheduled industrial pressure, predictable in timing, relentless, miscalculation in execution. By mid-1943, the daylight sky over Germany had become a battlefield of endurance rather than surprise. And as American formations pressed deeper, the question inside German command circles shifted quietly, from whether the bombing could be stopped to how long Germany could withstand it. That question would soon be answered from multiple angles. Adolf Hitler did not react to the American bombers with immediate panic. He reacted with disbelief. For years, he had dismissed strategic bombing as a tool of weak nations. In his worldview, wars were decided by armies seizing ground and breaking enemies face to face. Air power was meant to support that struggle, not replace it. The idea that aircraft alone could dismantle an industrial state ran against everything he believed about strength and endurance. When reports of large American formations reached him, his first instinct was to reinterpret them. Loss figures were emphasized, failures were magnified, successes were explained away as temporary. If bombers were reaching targets, it was because commanders had not been aggressive enough, or because saboteurs had failed. Responsibility, in Hitler's system, rarely flowed upward. He demanded solutions that matched his expectations rather than reality. Fighters were ordered to engage regardless of loss. Flak was told to fire more, shoot higher, cover everything. New weapons were promised instant results. Each directive assumed that willpower could compensate for material imbalance. But belief has limits. As daylight raids multiplied, Hitler's language shifted subtly. Confidence gave way to irritation. Irritation hardened into suspicion. He spoke less about inevitability and more about betrayal, by industry, by commanders, by the Luftwaffe itself. The bombers were no longer an annoyance. They were a contradiction, and contradictions in Hitler's mind could only be resolved by force or by denial. That denial would shape every response that followed. The Luftwaffe entered 1943 already strained. Years of continuous combat had thinned its experienced pilots. Training programs shortened. Fuel allocations tightened. Aircraft designs prioritized speed and firepower over endurance. None of this mattered when fighting close to home or supporting ground campaigns. Against massed bombers, it became fatal. Intercepting B-17 formations demanded repeated climbs to high altitude, precise coordination, and sustained attacks through defensive fire. Fighters that survived the first pass often lacked fuel for a second. Pilots returned shaken. Aircraft riddled with damage. Losses were not just numerical. They were cumulative. Veteran pilots died faster than replacements could learn. New pilots entered combat with minimal hours, facing formations that punished inexperience instantly. Every engagement sharpened the imbalance. Goering promised solutions: heavy fighters, rockets, frontal attacks. Some worked briefly. None scaled fast enough. The Luftwaffe was bleeding skill, not machines, and once skill was gone, no factory could replace it. The B-17 was not invincible. It was methodical. Its true strength lay not in armor or guns alone, but in numbers and formation geometry. When dozens of bombers flew together, their defensive fire overlapped, creating zones of danger that German fighters had never encountered at this scale. Precision, often imperfect, was still sufficient when repeated. German defenses relied on disruption, breaking formations, isolating aircraft, but American crews trained relentlessly to hold position. Even damaged bombers stayed in formation when possible, absorbing punishment that would have shattered looser systems. Technology, in this contest, favored repetition over brilliance, and repetition was something Germany could not match. As these pressures mounted in the air, their effects spread outward, reaching factories, homes, and the streets below, where another side of the war was being lived daily. For much of the war, German civilians experienced conflict indirectly. Newsreels showed victories. Radios spoke of resilience. Air raids, when they came, were often at night, disorienting, frightening, but distant in cause and effect. Daylight bombing changed that relationship. American formations arrived under clear skies, visible for miles. The sound came first, a deep, continuous roar that did not fade quickly. People looked up and saw rows of aircraft crossing overhead, unhurried, unbroken. It was no longer possible to imagine the war as something happening elsewhere. Factories were struck while shifts were still working. Trains stopped mid-route. Streets emptied in seconds as sirens wailed. The daylight made destruction undeniable. Smoke rose while people watched, shelters filled with a different kind of fear. Not the sudden shock of night raids, but the slow certainty that targets were being selected deliberately. Morale did not collapse immediately. Germans adapted, as populations always do, but confidence eroded. Each clear day carried tension. Each returning formation suggested endurance rather than desperation. The enemy was not improvising. He was planning. For the men inside the B-17s, daylight offered no concealment, only clarity. They saw the flak bursts rise toward them, black and precise. They watched fighters assemble in the distance, climbing patiently before diving into formation. Casualties were visible, not abstract. When a bomber fell, there was no ambiguity about what had happened. Loss rates were brutal. In 1943, a bomber crew's chances of completing a full tour were dangerously low. Crews knew the statistics. They flew anyway. Discipline held formations together where fear might have scattered them. Training emphasized procedure over instinct. Hold position, maintain speed, cover the aircraft beside you. When bombers turned for home, damaged and leaking fuel, survival felt provisional rather than earned. Many returned to fly again days later. This persistence, more than any single mission, shaped German calculations. The Americans were absorbing losses that would have broken other air forces. American planners spoke of precision as a moral distinction. Factories, not cities. Industry, not civilians. In practice, war rarely respected such boundaries, Bombs missed, flak deflected aim. Industrial targets sat near homes and hospitals. Daylight made intentions visible, but it did not prevent suffering. Yet the moral calculation ran in both directions. German industry-powered weapons used across Europe. Disrupting it promised an earlier end to the war. This logic hardened with every mission. Once bombing reached scale, restraint became irrelevant. The system fed itself. Targets were selected not only for impact, but for pressure. The goal was no longer disruption, it was exhaustion. And exhaustion, in time, would force a decisive moment in the air war over Germany. That moment was approaching fast. By the summer of 1943, the Daylight Air War reached a point where theory could no longer hide reality. The targets now lay deep inside Germany's industrial core. Ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, aircraft factories at Regensburg, facilities so central to the war economy that their loss could ripple across every front. On August 17, 1943, the United States launched a mission unlike anything before it. Two large bomber forces took off from Britain, divided to confuse German defenses. One headed toward Regensburg, the other toward Schweinfurt. The plan was ambitious and dangerous. Strike both targets in a single day, then send one force onward to North Africa, stretching German interception beyond endurance. From the moment the formations crossed the coast, resistance was relentless. German fighters attacked repeatedly in waves. Head-on passes tore through formations. Flak filled the sky over targets with dense, coordinated fire. Bombers fell steadily, some exploding mid-air, others spiraling down in flames. Crews held formation as long as they could. Gaps opened, then closed. Damaged aircraft pressed on. Others turned back, unable to continue. The bombing itself was partially successful. Facilities were hit, production was disrupted, but the cost was severe. American losses shocked planners. Dozens of bombers failed to return. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured in a single day. The numbers could not be hidden, even from a leadership accustomed to sacrifice. In Germany, reactions were conflicted. On paper, the Luftwaffe claimed victory. Bombers had been destroyed in numbers. Goering presented the losses as proof that daylight bombing was unsustainable. Hitler seized on this interpretation eagerly. He declared that the Americans had overreached, that such attacks would bleed themselves dry. Yet behind these declarations, something had changed. The targets had been reached. Despite concentrated defenses, despite losses, American bombers had struck precisely what they were sent to destroy. Repairs would take time. Production would slow. More importantly, the concept had been proven. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids revealed a brutal truth for both sides. For the Americans, unescorted daylight bombing was too costly to continue unchanged. Loss rates approached unacceptable levels. Morale, while intact, showed strain. For Germany, victory in the air no longer meant preventing damage. It meant merely increasing the cost. And cost, when measured against American industry, favored the attacker. Within German command circles, quiet concern replaced celebration. Fighter units reported exhaustion. Ammunition stocks fell. Maintenance backlogs grew. Pilots spoke of endless engagements against formations that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. Hitler's response was characteristic. He demanded more aggression. He demanded new weapons. He demanded that the Luftwaffe do what it no longer could, destroy a system built on scale rather than surprise, but the system was already adapting. The Americans did not abandon daylight bombing. They paused, studied, and adjusted. Escort fighters would soon extend their reach, tactics would change, losses would fall. And when that happened, the balance in the skies over Germany would tip permanently. The turning point had not arrived in a single explosion, but in the realization that the next phase would be even harder to stop. The solution to the crisis revealed itself not in Germany, but in the skies over Britain. American planners had always understood the central weakness of daylight bombing, the absence of escort fighters deep inside enemy territory. Bombers could defend themselves for a time, but not indefinitely. The answer was not heavier armor or more guns. It was reach. By late 1943, that reach arrived. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, most decisively the P-51 Mustang, changed the air war in a way German command had not anticipated. Unlike earlier escorts, these fighters could accompany bombers from takeoff to target and back again. They did not turn away at the edge of Germany. They stayed. For the Luftwaffe, this was catastrophic. German fighters now faced a choice with no safe option: intercept the bombers and be attacked by escorts, engage the escorts, and leave bombers unchallenged. The sky, once structured around predictable engagements, became hostile everywhere. Losses accelerated. Experienced German pilots were hunted during climb and withdrawal, not just over targets. Airfields themselves came under attack. Training units were disrupted. Fuel shortages worsened as refineries were repeatedly struck. Hitler's reaction hardened into fixation. He ordered the defense of cities and factories at all costs. Fighters were tied to point defense, losing flexibility. New weapons, rockets, heavy cannons, were rushed into service, often before crews were fully trained. Promising jet designs were delayed by unrealistic demands and production constraints. None of it reversed the trend. By early 1944, American formations grew larger while German responses shrank. Flak still filled the air, but fighters arrived in fewer numbers and stayed for less time. Escort fighters roamed freely, attacking anything that flew or tried to. The strategic meaning of this shift was profound. Air superiority was no longer contested. It was being taken. With German skies increasingly open, bombing accuracy improved. Transportation networks were hit repeatedly. Aircraft production fell despite dispersal. Fuel shortages grounded fighters that still existed on paper. For Hitler, the contradiction became unavoidable. The Luftwaffe he had trusted to shield the Reich was being destroyed in the act of defending it. Each order to resist only accelerated the loss of what remained. The American bomber stream, once a test, had become a constant. And with air control slipping away, Germany's ability to maneuver, reinforce, or recover began to collapse across every front. The decisive moment had passed. What followed was not immediate defeat, but an unraveling whose consequences would be felt everywhere. The war was still being fought. Once air superiority tilted decisively, its effects moved rapidly from the sky to the ground. German industry did not collapse overnight. It strained, adapted, and endured. Factories were dispersed into forests, tunnels, and smaller workshops. Production schedules were reorganized. Civilian labor, foreign workers, and prisoners were pulled into longer shifts under worsening conditions. But endurance required fuel, and fuel was disappearing. Repeated attacks on synthetic fuel plants cut output month by month. Refineries that survived one raid were hit again before repairs could be completed. Rail lines delivering coal and raw materials were severed repeatedly. Even when factories remained intact, they stood idle for a lack of power or transport. The Luftwaffe felt this shortage first. Fighters sat grounded while bombers flew overhead unchallenged. Training hours were cut. Pilots entered combat with minimal preparation, if they entered it at all. Aircraft production figures, though impressive on paper, masked a growing hollowness. Machines existed without fuel. Crews existed without experience. Inside German command reports, the language shifted. Where once there had been confidence, there was now urgency. Requests for protection multiplied. Competing demands, cities, factories, transport hubs, overwhelmed available defenses. No prioritization could solve a shortage that was structural rather than tactical. Civilian life adjusted to permanent disruption. Transportation slowed to a crawl. Food distribution became uneven. Air raid alarms interrupted work daily. Shelters filled repeatedly, sometimes without incident, sometimes with devastating consequence. The psychological burden of daylight bombing accumulated quietly but relentlessly. And through it all, the bombing did not pause. American formations arrived with increasing regularity. Missions became routine rather than exceptional. The war economy was no longer responding to strikes. It was reacting to a sustained condition. For German planners, this was the most damaging realization of all. Bombing had ceased to be an event. It had become an environment. The longer it lasted, the less room remained for recovery. By late 1944, internal assessments acknowledged what public statements could not. Aircraft output declined despite increased effort. fuel reserves fell to critical levels. Transportation networks fractured beyond quick repair. Germany was still fighting, but it was fighting with diminishing means. And the full consequences of this imbalance were about to shape the final phase of the war in Europe. By early 1944, the strategic consequences of the air war were no longer confined to German factories or airfields. They reached every battlefield where Germany still struggled to hold ground. The most critical effect was invisible from the air: paralysis. With rail yards shattered and bridges repeatedly destroyed, German units found themselves unable to move when movement mattered most. Reinforcements arrived late, or not at all. Fuel shortages forced armored formations to ration training and delay redeployment. Commanders planned operations knowing that resupply could not be guaranteed. When Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, this imbalance became decisive. In the months before D-Day, bombing shifted toward transportation networks, airfields, and communications. German responses were limited, predictable, and increasingly ineffective. Fighters that remained were scattered, fuel-starved, and tied to defending individual points rather than contesting the skies as a whole. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German power, could no longer influence events at scale. Internal German reports reflected the change with unusual clarity. They spoke of critical shortages, irreversible losses, and operational immobility. These were not words of propaganda. They were admissions written for survival, not morale. Hitler, isolated from the front but inundated with reports, continued to demand resistance. New weapons were promised salvation. Counteroffensives were ordered without the means to support them. Each directive widened the gap between intention and capability. Meanwhile, Allied air power tightened its grip. Bombers flew with fewer losses. Escort fighters dominated airspace. German aircraft avoided combat whenever possible, preserving machines that could no longer be used effectively. Control of the air, once contested, was now assumed by the Allies. For Germany, defeat was no longer a question of battlefield skill alone. It was structural. The foundations of modern warfare, fuel, transport, communication, had been systematically eroded. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy, the outcome had already been shaped far above the beaches. The sky over Germany had decided the ground war that followed. And with that realization, the story moved beyond battles and statistics, toward what this moment revealed about power, leadership, and the nature of modern war itself. The American bomber streams over Germany did more than destroy factories and fuel plants. They exposed a truth about modern war that ideology could not override. Power was no longer measured only by territory held or armies fielded. It was measured by endurance, by the ability to replace losses faster than an enemy could inflict them, and to sustain pressure without pause. In that contest, belief mattered less than production and confidence less than logistics. For Adolf Hitler, the appearance of massed American B-17s represented a contradiction he never fully resolved. He had trusted will, command, and aggression to overcome material imbalance. When those tools failed, he demanded more of them, accelerating the collapse they were meant to prevent. The Luftwaffe's defeat in the air did not come from a single battle. It came from being forced into a role it was never designed to perform, defending an entire nation day after day against an opponent whose resources were effectively limitless. For the men in the bombers, the victory was not abstract. It was measured in survival, in empty bunks, in formations that returned thinner than they had departed. The cost was real, and it was paid continuously. For German civilians, the war became unavoidable. Daylight stripped away distance and illusion. The sky itself became a reminder that the conflict could no longer be managed, redirected, or postponed. In the end, the air war over Germany did not end the conflict on its own, but it reshaped everything that followed. It weakened resistance before armies advanced. It limited choices before decisions were made. It turned planning into reaction and confidence into improvisation. When the bombers passed overhead, they left behind more than smoke and rubble. They left a silence in which the outcome was no longer in doubt. And in that silence, the future of warfare revealed itself, relentless, industrial, and unforgiving to those who mistook belief for capacity.